Hello, Bio 245. So we're here to talk about brains now. So yeah, if you continue on down your list from the last one, we just did a little bit of spinal cord stuff. So now we're going to go to the nervous system. I don't know why I'm pointing to my list. You can't see it. But here we are. Here is our happy Mr. Brain that we love so dearly. So just go down the list, and you'll notice that next to some of these words, it has PL dot. That just means plural, or the plural form of the word. Okay. All right. So the first two words here, fissures and sulci. Sulcus would be the singular. Fissure obviously would be the singular, but they're very similar, but one's deeper than the other. So a sulcus, I'm going to start off with first, a sulcus, or plural sulci, is going to be these, see, you know how brains kind of have that typical wrinkled look. The dips and crevices, those are going to be a sulcus. Okay, so here is a sulcus, here is a sulcus. So it's just between these ridges, right? A fissure is a deeper sulcus, basically. Okay, so you can see that there's this one that wraps all the way around like this. That is considered to be a fissure. Even here between the two halves of your brain, that's considered to be a fissure as well. Okay, so sulcus is just less deep, and you can actually see this, I think, on this model. Let's see here. Let go, bro. So you can see the little bit of the difference. So if you look here, this is a sulcus, doesn't go very deep. If you look here, it's a fissure. So for a sulcus, it's going to be the less deep guys here, so you can see the cortex wrapping down. So remember from our last video, cortex is just this pink stripe or the gray matter. So you can see the sulcus coming down like this, and the fissure is more deep and continuous. So you can see that that pink stripe goes quite a bit further down, so that would be considered to be a fissure. Okay. A gyrus is a little different. A gyrus is actually going to be those ridges I was referring to that are that border the sulcus, okay? So here's a gyrus, here's a gyrus, here's a gyrus. So all these ridges are considered to be a gyrus. And the reason why our brain has all these dips and folds and all this kind of stuff is because it actually increases the surface area for neurons to exist in. So we have more processing capacity than, for example, a mouse. A mouse has a completely smooth brain. It's pretty cool first time you see it. But yeah, so we have all these wrinkles and stuff. That's important to increase our surface area. Next on our list, we have these things called cerebral hemispheres. You guys probably know that we have a right and left half of the brain, and they always say that there's like perhaps a functional difference between individuals if they use more of their right or more of their left brain. There's a little bit of data to support that, but not much. But cerebral hemispheres, you have one half and you have another half. So there's your cerebral hemispheres, okay? Just like the globe has hemispheres, there's two hemi. All right, and then you have these things called lobes on your brain. So the lobes are, they're mainly defined by their cytology, so by how the cells look, but on the outside, they're not hugely different. So one thing to keep in mind is they're named the same thing as the bone that overlies them. So for example, this is the front of the brain, so this is the frontal lobe, just like the frontal bone. If you turn this to the side, you'll see that there's this like structure here that looks like a thumb sticking out. That thumb is going to be the temporal lobe, and it sits inside of the temporal bone. On the back of your brain, kind of sitting on top of this little couch cushion thing here, so here, this is going to be your occipital lobe. And then at the top, majority of the top is going to be your parietal lobes. And since we do have two halves of the brain, you have two lobes of each. So you have two frontal lobes, two parietal lobes, two temporal lobes, and two occipital lobes. Okay, so technically speaking. And we already talked about cortex, but cortex is going to be just that layer that wraps around the upper portion of the brain. Okay, and again, these are where all the neurons are that do all the processing for our thinking and processing hearing and sensory data and putting out motor output as well. And cerebral white matter we've also talked about, but that's going to be just that deep myelinated axons that are going out. Okay. Okay, continuing on. Let's actually get to the structures. So first on your list is olfactory bulbs. Olfactory bulbs are, so here again is the front of our brain, and we know that because the thumb, that temporal lobe, points towards the front. So it points towards the front. Your thumb points towards the front. So if you take your front of your brain and you turn it over, see these like white things sticking out? Those are your olfactory bulbs. Okay. Moving on, we have something called the chiasm, okay? It's not especially great on here, so I'll show you in a couple models, but the chiasm is where the two optic nerves cross over. So here's your olfactories, like I already said. These little nubbins are your optic nerves cut, okay? So you can imagine that one will continue out to your eyeball, and the other guy will continue out to your eyeball, okay? But when your optic nerves come in, they cross over each other, and we have two, and so here's that X right here where they cross. And I have these two models here that also kind of show it. So here's one. So this is actually a deep brain structure, so don't worry too much about this at the moment. But turning this over, here's your optic nerve, there's your optic nerve, and you can see that they cross over in this X shape. I think that's a little more clear on this particular model. And you can see it on this model as well. This is the same structure as we just looked at, but smaller and more detailed. And if you turn this over, again, here's your optic nerve, and they cross over at the chiasm. And it's just that X shape. Moving on down, we have the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is not on either of these models, but the pituitary gland usually sticks out on the ventral side. So here, when I talk about ventral for the brain is the bottom, dorsal for the brain is the top. It's just how cats are oriented, so that's how they do. But typically, it sticks out just underneath where your optic chiasm is, and it looks like a little pink bean. It's actually glandular tissue. It's not even nervous tissue, but here, we actually have a model to show you now. So if you look at the front here, so again, there's the frontal lobe, here's your temporal lobe, the thumb pointing towards the front, right? And you can see this little pink jelly bean sticking out right here. So here it is put together so you can see a little better. But there you go. There's your olfactory bulbs again, your optic nerves poking out, and your pituitary gland here is obscuring the chiasm. Okay? Moving on. We have these things called mammillary bodies. So this is actually kind of nice that it doesn't have the pituitary gland because you can more easily see the mammillary bodies. Let's talk a little bit about the pituitary gland though. You might remember that when we talked about the skull, and we had that sphenoid bone here, that we talked about the sella turcica, and I mentioned maybe to a few of you that in the sella turcica, that's where the pituitary gland sits. So there you go, pituitary gland sitting right there in the sella turcica, okay? And you can see that it's kind of sticking out towards the front, okay? Okay, so like I said, if you cut away that pituitary gland, you'll very easily, again, so here's our front, if you flip it over, right behind where the pituitary gland should be, there's these two little bumps here. So these two little bumps are going to be your mammillary bodies. Okay, so yes, it's no surprise that there are two lumps on the front of something called mammillary bodies. Okay, so it's just that's what I think of. And that's how I remember it. Moving on, we have the brainstem. So the brainstem is dominantly going to be this guy coming out of the bottom. But if you open up your brain and you look at the half view, because yes, you will need to know some half view structures, there's your brainstem there as well. Okay? Okay. And then moving up from the brainstem, we have something called the midbrain. So this you can mainly only see from the inside, but this portion right here, this is your midbrain. Okay? So not this round guy that's sticking out of the front, but just right here underneath where this space is. Okay? That's your midbrain. The next structure on your list is called the cerebral peduncles. So pretty much the most beautiful word you've ever heard. But the cerebral peduncles, I kind of think of like the throat of the brain. So like if the brainstem and all that is the neck of the brain and the brain is the head, I always think of the cerebral peduncles like the throat. So it's this ridged columnar looking kind of structure right here. And you can see it really well on this model. So again, here's the front, we know that. Here's our optic chiasm. Here's where the pituitary gland would stick out. There's your mammillary bodies. And here are your cerebral peduncles, these kind of column-like structures that are ridged. Moving on, we have the pons. On the full brain, the pons is this swollen guy right here just above your brainstem, okay? It's technically part of your brainstem, but anyway, it's this swelling right here, okay? You can also see that on this guy, this like sad broken guy, but here's the pons here on this particular model. So again, it's this swelling above the brainstem. You can also see it on this smaller version of that is a little more detailed, but here is your pons again, this big swelling. Okay. Next is your medulla. Your medulla is immediately underneath your pons. So here's your pons, and then just underneath it, that's where your medulla would be. So you probably heard like the Waterboy movie, like medulla oblongata makes you ornery. It doesn't, but it does help with respiration and all that stuff, so that's pretty cool, and it's right there underneath your pons. And again, you can see it more clearly on this model, so here's your pons once more, and then your medulla is this slight swelling just beneath it. You can see it on this model as well. Here's your pons, and then there is the swelling of your medulla immediately underneath it. Moving on. Next we have cerebellum. So cerebellum keeps falling off this model, so I typically take it off. But the cerebellum it's not a second brain necessarily, but it does a little stuff that's a little functionally different from the rest of the brain, which is called the cerebrum. But anyway, your cerebellum is this brownish stuff. It looks like a little couch cushion that your brain sits on. So there's your cerebellum here. If you cut your cerebellum open, you will expose the arbor vitae. The arbor vitae is this white branched stuff inside of the cerebellum. Okay, so there's your arbor vitae. Moving on, we have the thalamus. So the thalamus you can see as an internal structure, but you can also see it as an external structure on these particular models because these are deep, okay? So looking at it from a side view first, just to show you, the thalamus is going to be this globular looking guy right here. So again, just to orient you, this is the front. You can see the mammillary body right there. You can see part of that optic chiasm here and the optic nerve sticking out of the front, okay? So this globular bit right here with this dot in the middle, this is a half side view of your thalamus. In reality, the thalamus is these two egg shapes right here, okay? So just to orient you once more, we're looking at the front. Here's your mammillary bodies tucked up in there, this little I don't know what number that is. I think it's 48, but number 48 in here. So those are your mammillary bodies. Here's your optic chiasm, and these are the two halves of your thalamus. Your thalamus is these like two big egg shapes. So looking at it three-dimensionally, if you were to peel off the rest of the brain, there's your thalamus. But the half view still looks the same. So opening it here, you can see, again, just to orient you, this is going to be the front. You can see your mammillary bodies there. You can see the optic nerve and the chiasm right there. There's this glob with the dot in the middle. That is going to be your thalamus. Okay. And after your thalamus is the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus, so since we're already looking at this, so here is that glob again. That's going to be the half view of your thalamus with the dot in the middle. This little triangular region right underneath it that kind of leads into the optic chiasm a little bit, and then here's where the pituitary would come off. Actually, here's this. No, that one doesn't have it. You can see it on here. That here's again your thalamus, right? There's your hypothalamus. This triangular region leads into the optic chiasm, but also here into the pituitary, because the thalamus. You guys will learn that the hypothalamus and the pituitary are highly interrelated to each other. You'll learn that in lecture, hopefully. But anyway, so there's your hypothalamus, okay? And you can see it on this model as well. Again, there's your thalamus. There's the hypothalamus. And you guys should recall, hypo always means below or underneath. So in this case, here's your thalamus, and underneath it, hypo is your hypothalamus, okay? You'll also see here the interthalamic adhesion. So I've kept telling you that there's this glob that is the thalamus with this dot in the middle. That dot in the middle is your interthalamic adhesion. Okay, interthalamic adhesion. And here you can see it again. Here's the thalamus, and there's your interthalamic adhesion. Okay, can't see it on that one because it's intact, but just to show you on this one as well. Here's your thalamus, and here's your interthalamic adhesion. Moving on, we have our corpus callosum. Now, the corpus callosum you guys may have heard of before, but it's this band of myelinated axons that keeps the two hemispheres together, not only physically, but also functionally. So that's how these guys communicate. So if you take the halves apart, like so, you'll see that there's this giant white band here. That's going to be your corpus callosum. And I always think like corpus means body. Callosum, I always think of like Colosseum, where you have these two things interacting with each other in concert with each other. So I don't know, that's what I think of that helps me, but here's the corpus callosum, okay? Moving on down, we have the pineal gland. So now we're moving to the back side of the brain. So again, if you want to look at the back, let's just show you real quick. Stick this guy together. So remember, this is our front with your olfactory bulbs and the temporal lobes pointing towards the front. Here's the back. I removed the cerebellum because it falls off. But if you want to see the pineal gland's kind of on the back, and here's, again, you kind of have to bend it down. Whoops. You have to bend it down, and that will expose your pineal gland. But it's easier to show you on these guys here. So here's this model. Again, this is our thalamus, right? Here's our optic nerves and our optic chiasm. There's where our pituitary gland would be. There's our mammillary bodies, cerebral peduncles, pons, medulla. So if you take this guy, turn it around, you will reveal the pineal gland. The pineal gland is this pink nubbin that sticks out right here in the back. If you want to see it on the full brain, again, you do kind of have to peel back that cerebrum, that occipital lobe, and pull it up, okay? If you want to see it from the half view, though, that's totally doable. Here it is here. So you can actually see there's this pink band. I'll show you on the side, actually. There's this pink band right here. That is the extension of your pineal gland, and it just sticks out of the back eventually. Moving on, we have the choroid plexus on this particular list. So for the choroid plexus, it's the thing that makes this stuff called cerebrospinal fluid, and it fills up the inside of your brain and also the inside of your spinal cord. But on this particular model, it's blue. So there's your choroid plexus, okay? And choroid plexus is also inside, so you can see here, okay? On this particular model, you can see a choroid plexus as well. It's usually indicated by blue, okay? The one time where choroid plexus is not indicated in blue is on this model, which we'll talk about a little bit later, but I just want to show you that there is choroid plexus on this particular guy, but it's in pink. So that's the only time you're going to see it in pink is on this weird model, which we'll talk about, okay? Moving on down our brain, put this guy back together real quick. I just had like anger and took them apart, I guess. But moving on down the brain, we have this structure called the fornix. The fornix I usually talk about right after the corpus callosum because they're kind of related to each other. Like they look very similar and they're just right next to each other. But now I have this together. Excellent. So here is your corpus callosum, just like I said. And just underneath is this next white band. That is going to be your fornix. Okay. On this one you can see it as well. So here's that white band of the corpus callosum, and here's the fornix just underneath. And on this model, that half view of the thalamus, there's the front, right? There's your optic nerve right there. So if you turn this guy around, looking at the half view, there's your thalamus. Just above it, there's your fornix. So you can see that in a couple of models. Next on your list are the ventricles. So ventricles are gaps inside of your brain, okay? So basically, if you think about it, if you take your hand and you make a fist, there's still going to be space inside, right? That's basically like the brain here. The brain takes up a lot of space, but on the very inside are these little gaps. It's kind of hard to see, but in this, it shows it really nicely. So I just took the brain here, just to show you. So I took the brain and I took off the top half. And then we turn it over and look deep, and you can see here's a hole right here. There's a sign of one of your ventricles, okay? So just to kind of demonstrate that there are these gaps inside of the brain. There are a few ventricles that you need to know about. First off, we have the lateral ventricles. The lateral ventricles kind of, if you look at a front view of the brain, they kind of go off laterally. That's why they call it that, okay? So when we're talking about ventricles, this is the model that we typically pull out. So the way that these ventricles kind of orient themselves in the brain, here's your deep structures, right? Your thalamus and all that other kind of stuff. They kind of wrap around the thalamus. So you can actually see I can tuck the thalamus inside of there, okay? Sorry, there you go. Now you can see. So I can actually wrap it around the thalamus like so. So that lateral ventricle is actually that ventricle I was showing you earlier too. So if I pull this up, this inside is actually part of your thalamus, okay? So I could tuck that back into this brain structure, turn it around, and you can see there's my thalamus, and there's like the three-dimensional view of the thalamus, and then I turn this over, and there's that lateral ventricle because it wraps around, okay? So that's your lateral ventricle. There's two of them because you have two halves of your brain. If you look between where the two halves of the thalamus come together, you'll notice that, like, so here's our half view of the thalamus, that it's kind of shallow in here. There's actually a ventricle inside of there too. So when I put these two halves of the thalamus together, there's a gap inside. And that's going to be your third ventricle. The lateral ventricles count as 1 and 2, but you don't need to know which one's 1 and which one's 2. That's depicted on here as well. So again, our lateral ventricles wrap around our each half of the thalamus, and looking in between here, this triangular region, that is the ventricle that's kind of in between your thalamus and your hypothalamus. In fact, there's even this hole in the middle, see that? That's where that interthalamic connection is, that interthalamic adhesion. Okay, so it goes through this hole. Then you have this thing that is called the cerebral aqueduct. The cerebral aqueduct connects the third ventricle to the fourth ventricle. Okay, so this here is the fourth ventricle. It's kind of down behind your brainstem and between there where the cerebellum is. But anyway, so here, there's your cerebellum, there's the arbor vitae. Here's where your third ventricle would be. This is the cerebral aqueduct, and it's connecting here to the fourth ventricle. So here it is three-dimensionally. We have our third ventricle, the cerebral aqueduct, and it connects here to the fourth ventricle. Ultimately, this fluid will continue all the way down into the spinal cord. Okay? Okay, so lastly, it's having me talk about the meninges, but the meninges are a little bit easier to show on the spinal cord. So I'm just going to describe the meninges real quick for the brain. So for the meninges for the brain, what they are is just this layer of connective tissue that kind of surrounds and protects the brain. It comes in a few layers. When you get a meningeal infection, for example, you're getting an infection of this protective layer around the brain that kind of keeps it protected from the skull. So first off, you have the pia mater, and the pia mater wraps around the brain and keeps it protected, almost like saran wrap, directly. Above that, you have the arachnoid mater. It's called the arachnoid mater because between the pia mater and the arachnoid mater, it looks like web, like a spider web kind of. And then above that, you have the dura mater, and dura means hard, so it's considered to be the hard mother, and it's almost anchored to the skull. And we actually have a model that kind of shows the meninges just a little bit, and shows that there's this gap. But here we go. So here's our guy, and here's the brain, of course. So you can see that there's this one layer that wraps really close to the brain. Again, almost like saran wrap. Like if you do a dissection and peel it off, it's as tight to it as saran wrap would be. And then you have this outer layer. So these collectively would be your meninges. Okay, and then that would be filled with fluid. But that is it. For the brain stuff, you can see that there's like all these spaces and stuff, but we're going to talk about that when we talk about the spinal cord. So see you then.